Child killer mocks the judge, thinking he'd get away with it. Then his mother stands up. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. There are moments in life that change everything. When time seems to slow down and the world holds its breath. In the small town of Millfield, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in the Fairview County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed to capacity, with every wooden bench filled and spectators lining the walls. Outside, news vans had been parked for days, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. This case had captured national attention. The handsome law student from a respected family, accused of the unthinkable. Thomas Reed sat perfectly still at the defense table. At 24, he looked younger than his years, clean-cut, with an open face and attentive, blue eyes that never wavered. His pressed navy suit and subtle tie gave him the appearance of a young professional rather than a man on trial for murder. Throughout the 6-week trial, he had maintained the same composed demeanor, occasionally nodding to the jury or leaning over to whisper to his attorney. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Leonard Malloy entered the courtroom. The judge, a veteran of the bench with silver hair and deep-set eyes that had seen it all, took his seat and surveyed the crowded room. "Be seated," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years on the bench. In the front row behind the prosecution sat Sarah Baines, the lead detective who had spent months building the case. Her face revealed nothing, but her fingers gripped her notebook just a little tighter than necessary. Beside her, District Attorney Daniel Harper stared straight ahead, his shoulders tense beneath his suit jacket. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as Judge Malloy spoke. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The jury foreman, a retired high school teacher with reading glasses perched on his nose, rose slowly. "We have, Your Honor." The clerk approached, took the folded paper, and delivered it to the judge. Judge Malloy's expression remained neutral as he reviewed the verdict before handing it back. "The defendant will please rise." Thomas stood alongside his attorney, his mother Margaret Reed rising behind him in the gallery. Once a respected prosecutor, herself, Margaret's elegant posture betrayed only the slightest tremor in her hands. In the matter of the state versus Thomas Reed on the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant. The courtroom seemed to inhale collectively. Not guilty. A wave of reactions swept through the courtroom. Gasps, murmurs, a sob from somewhere in the back. Thomas's face remained impassive for a beat before a relieved smile spread across his features. His attorney clasped his shoulder in congratulation. On the other side of the aisle, the parents of 9-year-old Ellie Mathers sat in stunned silence, the father's arm around his wife's shoulders. Judge Malloy rapped his gavel. "Order," he commanded, and the room gradually quieted. "The jury is thanked and excused. Mr. Reed, you are free to go." Thomas turned to embrace his father, Richard Reed, a powerful local attorney whose influence was felt throughout the county. The defense team began gathering their materials, relief evident on their faces. But then something unexpected happened. Margaret Reed, who had maintained her composure throughout the trial, suddenly rose to her feet. Her face had drained of all color and her voice, though quiet, cut through the courtroom chatter like a knife. "Your Honor," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I cannot remain silent any longer. I cannot let this stand." The room fell silent once more. Thomas turned toward his mother, his smile faltering. For just a fraction of a second, something flashed across his face. A twitch at the corner of his mouth, a momentary tightening of his jaw. Judge Malloy leaned forward. "Mrs. Reed, these proceedings are concluded. I cannot let this lie continue." Margaret persisted, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "I have evidence that was not presented in this trial." Detective Baines straightened in her seat, her eyes locked on Margaret Reed. "I cannot lie anymore," Margaret said, her gaze shifting to her son. "Not for you. Not after what you did." Thomas Reed's confident smile had vanished completely. For the first time since his arrest, real fear showed in his eyes. And that was the moment everything changed in Millfield. 3 months earlier, Millfield was just another quiet Midwest town where people left their doors unlocked and children played freely in front yards until dusk called them home. A place where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. October 17th began like any ordinary Thursday. The air was crisp with autumn, trees lining Main Street painted in shades of amber and gold. School buses made their morning rounds, shopkeepers raised their blinds, and parents dropped off younger children at Millfield Elementary. This was the morning 9-year-old Ellie Mathers vanished. She insisted she could walk to school by herself. Claire Mathers would later tell Detective Frank Patterson, her voice hollow with regret. It was only 3 blocks. We'd practiced the route so many times. At 7:45 a.m., Ellie had skipped down the front porch steps of her white colonial home on Maple Lane, her purple backpack bouncing against her small frame, lunchbox clutched in one hand. Her mother watched her reach the corner before heading back inside to get ready for work. Ellie never arrived at school. By 8:30 a.m., the school's automated system had called the Mathers household to report her absence. By 9:15 a.m., Claire Mathers had retraced the route to school twice, panic rising with each step. By noon, half the town was searching, calling Ellie's name through neighborhoods and parks. What no one noted at the time was that this was also the day Thomas Reed left town for a law conference at State University, nearly 2 hours away. The local police department, unprepared for a case of this magnitude, initiated standard missing child protocols. Chief Williams called in Detective Frank Patterson, a veteran officer with kind eyes and a methodical approach, to lead the investigation. Patterson immediately secured the route from the Mathers home to the school, but precious hours had already passed. "I remember that day so clearly," said Donna Lewis, who owned the bakery on Main Street. "We all thought she'd turn up. Kids wander off sometimes, you know. Nobody wanted to think the worst." By evening, the local news had picked up the story. Missing 9-year-old Ellie Mathers flashed across television screens throughout the county. Volunteers gathered at the community center, organized into search parties, and combed through wooded areas and empty lots with flashlights as darkness fell. Among the volunteers was Margaret Reed, who arrived alone at the community center around 6 p.m. She was so composed, but deeply concerned, recalled Pastor David Mitchell, who was coordinating volunteer efforts. She immediately took charge of organizing the search grids, making sure everyone had water and flashlights. Said her husband Richard was handling legal aspects of the search, whatever that meant. What nobody knew then was that Margaret had tried, calling her son Thomas 3 times that day, with no response. Each call went straight to voicemail. As the search continued fruitlessly into the night, state authorities were notified. By morning, Ellie's face was on every local channel, and the community had transformed overnight. Parents kept their children indoors. Neighbors eyed strangers with suspicion. The invisible threads of trust that had held Millfield together for generations began to fray. On day 2 of the search, State Detective Sarah Baines arrived from the Capitol. At 42, Baines had handled dozens of missing persons cases. But something about Millfield immediately put her on edge. People weren't just scared, she would later note in her case files. They were guarded, like they already knew something they weren't saying. When Baines asked about prominent families in the area who might have information or influence, several names came up. But when she mentioned the Reeds, she noticed something curious. People would hesitate, glance away, change the subject. That same afternoon, Thomas Reed returned to Millfield from his conference, expressing shock at the news about Ellie. He immediately joined the volunteer search efforts, his law school credentials and family name lending him an air of authority. What he didn't know was that Detective Baines was watching him from across the community center, taking note of how he scanned the room before approaching the volunteer coordinator. And what Thomas Reed couldn't possibly have known was that, in less than 24 hours, a dog walker would discover a child's purple backpack half buried in the mud along the creek bank in Westfield Park, a park located just 2 miles from the university where Thomas had been attending his conference. Thomas Reed was everything small-town parents hoped their children would grow into. Tall and well-spoken, with an easy smile that put people at ease, He moved through Millfield with the comfortable confidence of someone who had never known true hardship. Thomas was always the brightest student in my class. Remembered Mrs. Henley, his high school English teacher. The kind who could debate constitutional law at 16, but still help the freshmen with their homework. Everyone looked up to him. By 24, Thomas had compiled an impressive resume. Valedictorian at Millfield High, undergraduate, degree with honors from Northwestern, and now in his second year at State University Law School, where he maintained a perfect GPA. Between semesters, he clerked at his father's prestigious firm and volunteered with the town's youth mentorship program. On paper, he was flawless. Detective Sarah Baines learned all this within her first 48 hours in Millfield, along with the fact that Thomas had a solid alibi for the day Ellie disappeared. Conference attendance records showed he had signed in for the morning session at State University at 8:30 a.m., placing him 2 hours away when Ellie vanished. Fellow attendees confirmed seeing him there, but Sarah Baines hadn't become the youngest detective in her department by taking things at face value. "I'd like to see the actual sign-in sheet," she requested from the conference organizers, noting that several attendees described Thomas as unusually engaged during the morning sessions, asking questions and participating in discussions, almost as if he were deliberately drawing attention to himself. When Ellie's purple backpack was found in Westfield Park, the case took its first major turn. The park was just a short drive from the university where Thomas had been attending his conference. This proximity immediately raised questions, but Richard Reed was quick to dismiss any implications. "Hundreds of people from Millfield visit State University regularly," he pointed out during a community meeting. "This connection is tenuous at best and irresponsible to highlight." His words carried weight. The Reed name adorned the town's library and the hospital's East Wing. Richard had represented many of Millfield's business owners at some point, and the family's annual charity gala was the social event of the year. Thomas, meanwhile, joined search parties with tireless dedication. Local news cameras often captured him comforting volunteers or conferring seriously with police officers. He spoke eloquently when interviewed, his law school training evident in his measured, empathetic responses. "We're all devastated by Ellie's disappearance," he told Channel 8 News, his blue eyes sincere beneath the camera lights. "This isn't the Millfield I grew up in. We'll find her and bring her home." 3 days after the backpack discovery, the search reached its devastating conclusion. A state police officer, with a cadaver dog, found Ellie's body in a shallow ravine on the far side of Westfield Park, partially covered with leaves and branches. Though the news reported only that she had been found, the coroner's preliminary report indicated she had died within hours of her disappearance. The small town was shattered. Yellow police tape cordoned off large sections of the park. Parents walked their children to school in silent groups. Memorial candles appeared on porches throughout Millfield, and the elementary school flag remained at half-mast. Through it all, Thomas Reed continued to present the image of a community leader in mourning. He delivered a heartfelt speech at Ellie's candlelight vigil, standing shoulder to shoulder with the mayor and police chief. But it was during this vigil that District Attorney Daniel Harper first noticed something odd. When Thomas mentioned Ellie's name, he spoke of her in a peculiarly personal way, describing her smile and her love of drawing horses, details that seemed strangely specific for someone who claimed they had never met. Harper mentioned this to Detective Baines, who was already compiling a file of small inconsistencies in Thomas's statements. "Check if he was involved in any of the school programs," she suggested. "Find out if there's any connection we're missing." The next morning, as Baines reviewed school volunteer records, she made her first significant discovery. Thomas Reed had indeed been a reading mentor at Millfield Elementary the previous spring, and according to the coordinator's records, one of the children in his reading group had been Ellie Mathers. When confronted with this information during a routine follow-up interview, Thomas's perfect composure slipped for just a moment. "Oh, that program," he said, his fingers tightening slightly around his coffee cup. "There were so many children. I can't be expected to remember every name." But Sarah Baines had been watching his eyes, and she knew, with the certainty that had broken open dozens of her previous cases, that Thomas Reed had just lied. Contradictions in criminal investigations are like hairline cracks in glass, easy to miss at first glance, but once spotted, impossible to unsee. For Detective Sarah Baines, Thomas Reed's lie about knowing Ellie Mathers was the first visible crack in his carefully constructed facade. When someone lies about something that simple, that verifiable, they're hiding something much bigger, Baines explained to D.A. Harper as they reviewed case notes in the temporary office space the Millfield Police Department had provided. Harper nodded, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. 35, he was the youngest district attorney in county history. Ambitious but still finding his footing in high-profile cases. But lying doesn't make him a killer, Harper cautioned. His alibi for the conference is solid. Multiple witnesses place him there when Ellie disappeared, which is why we need to verify every minute of his schedule that day, Baines responded, spreading the conference agenda across the desk. The conference had begun with registration at 8 a.m. and a keynote address at 9 a.m. Thomas had signed the attendance sheet, participated in morning discussions, and even asked questions that several attendees remembered. On paper, his alibi seemed airtight, but when Baines contacted the conference organizers directly, she discovered a crucial detail. The afternoon sessions had ended early due to a scheduling conflict with the venue. The final panel, which Thomas was confirmed to have attended, had concluded at 2:30 p.m., not 5 p.m. as originally scheduled. Thomas had told police he'd return to Millfield around 6:30 p.m. after the conference ended. But if the conference had actually ended at 2:30 p.m., where was he for those 4 unaccounted hours? His drive home should have taken 2 hours max, Baines noted. That leaves at least 2 hours missing from his timeline. While Baines was tracing Thomas's movements, Officer Jensen, a young patrolman assisting with evidence collection, made a discovery at Westfield Park. During a secondary sweep of the area, surrounding where Ellie was found, he spotted something metallic partially embedded in the soil, a small gold pin in the shape of scales of justice, with the initials SLS engraved on the back. State Law Society, the honor society that Thomas Reed had been inducted into just months earlier. It could be a coincidence, Chief Williams suggested when Baines presented the pin. That park is right by the university. Any law student could have dropped it. Coincidences stack up quickly in this case, Baines replied, too quickly for comfort. The next morning, Baines and Harper called Thomas for another interview. They didn't mention the pin immediately, instead focusing on his timeline from the conference day. The conference records show the event ended at 2:30, Baines said, watching Thomas carefully. But you told us you didn't arrive back in Millfield until after 6:30. Can you count for those hours? Thomas smiled easily, though his knuckles whitened as he clasped his hands together on the table. Of course. After the conference, I met some classmates at the campus coffee shop to discuss the presentations. Then I grabbed dinner before heading back. Any witnesses who can confirm that? Harper asked. Several, I'm sure. I'd have to check who exactly was there. Baines slid a photograph across the table, the small gold pin cleaned and photographed against a ruler for scale. Do you recognize this? Thomas glanced at it casually. It looks like an SLS pin. Most members have one. This was found in Westfield Park near where Ellie Mathers was discovered. Thomas's expression didn't change, but Baines noticed how he closed his fist under the table when she mentioned Ellie's name. For just a second, his practiced smile vanished completely. That's unfortunate, he said, voice level. But as you know, many law students visit that park. It's a popular spot. Before Baines could press further, the door opened and Margaret Reed entered, her elegant appearance at odds with the stark interview room. Thomas, I came as soon as I heard you shouldn't be answering any more questions without representation. Mrs. Reed, Baines began, this is just a routine follow-up, which my son has cooperated with fully, Margaret replied coolly. But given the direction of your questions, I think we're done for today. She placed a protective hand on Thomas's shoulder. As they left, Harper looked deflated. That's it? We barely scratched the surface. Actually, Baines said thoughtfully, we learned quite a lot. Did you see his reaction when I mentioned Ellie's name? And more importantly, she added, Why did Margaret Reed show up exactly when we were getting to the uncomfortable questions? You think someone tipped her off? I think, Baines said, gathering the case files, that the Reed family has eyes and ears throughout this town, and I think Thomas Reed just became our primary person of interest. What neither detective knew was that back at the Reed family home, Thomas was having a rare moment of visible anger. You didn't need to intervene, he snapped at his mother as they entered the house. I had everything under control. Margaret studied her son's face with an expression that, for the first time, held a flicker of doubt. Did you? She asked quietly. Because I'm starting to wonder exactly what everything includes. Investigations have a rhythm, a natural flow that leads from evidence to conclusion. But in Millfield, Sarah Baines found herself swimming against a powerful current. The morning after Thomas E. Reed's interview, Chief Williams called Baines into his office. The usually straightforward police chief seemed uncomfortable, shifting papers on his desk without meeting her eyes. I think we need to expand our suspect pool, he said finally. The Reed connection is circumstantial at best. Iniel leaned forward. Chief, we have Thomas lying about knowing Ellie, unaccounted hours during the time of the murder, and his honor society pin at the crime scene. And we have a grieving town looking for answers, Williams countered. The Reeds are pillars of this community. We need absolute certainty before proceeding. As Baines left the office, her phone buzzed with a text from the evidence clerk. File you requested is missing. System shows it was checked out yesterday by Captain Morris. Captain Morris, who happened to be Richard Reed's former college roommate. Back at her temporary desk, Baines discovered that a witness statement from a university janitor who reported seeing Thomas's car still in the parking lot at 3:45 p.m., contradicting his timeline, had been incorrectly filed under miscellaneous tips rather than witness statements. By the time she found it, the janitor, had left for a 2-week vacation. My father thinks the entire town is jealous of our family, Thomas had told her casually during their last interview. At the time, it had seemed like an offhand comment. Now, it felt like a warning. That afternoon, the Millfield Herald ran a front-page story questioning the police department's focus on certain individuals rather than pursuing all possible leads. The article didn't name Thomas, but quoted sources close to the investigation, criticizing the direction of the case. When D.A. Harper called the newspaper to complain, he was informed that Richard Reed sat on the board of the media group that owned the Herald. It's like fighting smoke, Harper told Baines over coffee. Every time we get close, something shifts. Baines didn't respond immediately. She was watching a mother and daughter at another table, the girl about Ellie's age, happily coloring while her mother checked her phone. We need to look deeper into the mentorship program, Baines said finally. Thomas claimed he didn't remember Ellie, but he was her reading mentor for 3 months. Harper's research confirmed this. Not only had Thomas worked with Ellie, but, according to the program coordinator's notes, he had specifically requested her group when volunteer assignments were being made. Why would he lie about something so easily disproven? Harper wondered. Because people hide what matters most, Baines replied. And for some reason, his connection to Ellie matters enough to lie about. That evening, as Baines was leaving the police station, she found Richard Reed waiting beside her car, his expensive suit out of place in the municipal parking lot. Detective, he said pleasantly, I think it's time we had a conversation about where this investigation is heading. What had begun as a local tragedy in Millfield was rapidly transforming into a national talking point. Cable news vans lined Main Street, and social media buzzed with hashtags like Justice for Ellie and increasingly, Oz leave Reed alone. Sarah Baines watched this media transformation with growing concern. Somehow the narrative was shifting. Thomas Reed was being portrayed not as a suspect, but as a victim of overzealous investigators and small-town politics. It's a masterclass in deflection, Harper remarked as they watched a prominent legal analyst on the courthouse steps questioning the investigation's focus. Notice how they never deny the evidence. They just reframe it. The conversation with Richard Reed the previous evening had been brief, but unmistakably threatening. He had never directly told Baines to back off. but his parting words lingered. Careers are made and broken on cases like this, Detective. I'd hate to see yours become collateral damage in a rush to judgment. Now, watching the media circus, Baines understood the strategy. The court of public opinion was being carefully manipulated, and the Reed family had the resources to ensure favorable coverage. Targeted document leaks appeared in the press, an internal memo questioning evidence handling procedures, a preliminary lab report suggesting contamination of the crime scene. None mentioned Thomas directly, but collectively they painted a picture of investigative incompetence. "This is coordinated," Baines told Harper as they reviewed the latest news coverage in his office. On the muted television, Thomas could be seen volunteering at a children's charity event, his expression appropriately somber as he helped package care boxes. "He's playing the part perfectly," Harper observed. "The grieving community member, above suspicion." Baines shook her head. "No one's above suspicion, especially someone working this hard to appear innocent." A breakthrough came unexpectedly that afternoon. Lindsay Parker, a paralegal at the DA's office, approached Baines with information she'd been hesitant to share. "I went to high school with Thomas," she explained nervously. "He wasn't what everyone thinks he was." Lindsay described disturbing behavior she'd witnessed. Thomas manipulating teachers, orchestrating social conflicts, displaying a calculating coldness beneath his perfect student veneer. "There was an incident senior year with a girl who rejected him," Lindsay continued. "Her locker was vandalized, her college applications mysteriously lost. Nothing could be proven, but everyone knew." Baines arranged for Lindsay to provide a formal statement the next morning. But when morning came, Lindsay didn't appear. When Baines called her, the young woman's voice was tight with fear. "I've been thinking about it, and I must have been mistaken," she said mechanically. "Thomas was always kind and well-respected. I don't have anything negative to report." Before Baines could respond, Lindsay hung up. Later that day, Harper discovered that Lindsay's brother had just been hired at Reed & Associates, despite having failed the bar exam twice. "They got to her," Harper said, slamming his hand on his desk. "They're systematically eliminating every lead." Baines stared out the window at the media trucks. "This isn't just about protecting Thomas anymore," she said quietly. "There's something bigger they're hiding, something worth all this effort to control." That evening, as Baines reviewed the case files alone, her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. "Detective Baines," a trembling female voice said. "You don't know me, but I live across from Westfield Park. I saw something the day Ellie was found, something I've been afraid to tell anyone." "I'm listening," Baines replied, reaching for her notebook. "I saw Thomas Reed there, not just near the park, coming from exactly where they later found her body." The woman on the phone identified herself as Martha Wilson, a 73-year-old retired librarian who lived in a small house overlooking Westfield Park. Her voice quavered as she described what she'd seen. "It was around 4 o'clock. I was watering my plants on the porch when I noticed him coming up from the ravine area. I recognized him right away. He'd helped with the library fundraiser last summer." Baines arranged to meet Martha the following morning to take an official statement. The elderly woman seemed nervous but determined. "I should have come forward sooner," Martha admitted as she welcomed Baines into her modest living room. Family photos lined the walls, alongside shelves of carefully arranged books. "But when I saw his face on TV, talking about finding justice for that little girl, I couldn't stay silent." Martha's account was precise, her memory sharp despite her age. She described Thomas's clothing, his hurried pace, how he'd checked his surroundings before getting into his car, details too specific to be invented. He had mud on his shoes and something dark on his sleeve, she recalled. "At the time, I thought maybe he'd been hiking. Now I wonder." Baines recorded Martha's statement, aware that this testimony could be the tipping point in the case. An eyewitness placing Thomas at the exact location where Ellie was found during his unaccounted hours. "I'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to sign your statement officially," Baines explained. "This is important evidence, Mrs. Wilson." Martha nodded resolutely. "I've lived in this town my whole life, Detective. The truth matters more than the Reed name." As Baines left, She noticed a black sedan parked down the street, its engine running. The car pulled away as soon as she looked in its direction. That night, Martha Wilson fell down her basement stairs. The neighbor who found her the next morning reported that the staircase railing, which Martha had used reliably for years, appeared to be intact, but had somehow come loose from the wall. At the hospital, Baines found Martha heavily sedated with a concussion and a broken hip. The doctors informed her that the elderly woman would be unable to give any statements for at least several weeks. Convenient timing, Harper commented when Baines called him with the news. Baines went to examine Martha's house. The basement staircase looked ordinary enough, but a closer inspection revealed something troubling. The screws that had held the railing in place weren't stripped or worn. They had been deliberately loosened. While documenting this, Baines noticed a framed certificate on Martha's wall. In appreciation of your 30 years of service, Millfield Memorial Hospital. Next to it hung a photo of the hospital board of directors from 5 years earlier. Richard Reed stood prominently in the center. A quick check confirmed Baines's suspicion. Reed had been the hospital's legal counsel for over a decade, the same hospital where Martha now lay unable to testify. When Baines tried to visit Martha again the following day, she was informed that the patient had been moved to a private room with restricted access for her comfort and recovery. The order had come from the hospital administrator himself. "They're isolating our witness," Baines told Harper, "and there's not a damn thing we can legally do about it." Meanwhile, across town, preliminary hearings for the case against Thomas Reed had begun. Despite the mounting evidence, Thomas appeared untroubled, conferring calmly with his attorney. Margaret sat directly behind him, her expression unreadable. Only once, when the prosecutor mentioned Ellie Mather's name, did Baines notice Margaret's gaze shift, not to the prosecutor or the judge, but to her son's face. And in that brief glance was something Baines hadn't seen before: doubt. The county courthouse stood like a stone sentinel at the center of Millfield, its marble columns a reminder of law's permanence in a town where truth seemed increasingly fluid. Inside courtroom 3, the preliminary hearing to determine if Thomas Reed would stand trial had entered its second day. Today, Margaret Reed would take the stand. "The defense calls Margaret Reed," announced James Donovan, Thomas's attorney, a polished Harvard graduate handpicked by Richard Reed. Margaret moved, with practiced dignity, to the witness stand. At 56, she remained striking, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back, her navy suit immaculate. As a former prosecutor herself, she knew exactly how to present on the stand: poised, articulate, and above all, believable. "Mrs. Reed," Donovan began after the oath, "can you account for your son's whereabouts on the evening Thomas returned from the law conference?" "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice steady. "Thomas called me around 6:15 to say he was nearly home. He arrived at approximately 6:40 and we had dinner together at 7:30. "And did Thomas leave the house again that evening?" "No. We watched a documentary about Supreme Court history together until about 10 cars, when he went upstairs to review his conference notes." Harper, cross-examining, approached carefully. "Mrs. Reed, you previously stated to investigators that Thomas called you at 5:45, not 6:15. Which time is accurate?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Margaret's face. "I must have misspoken earlier. It was definitely 6:15. And the documentary you mentioned, do you recall the title?" Margaret hesitated. "Something about Justice Warren, I believe. Thomas selected it." "Mrs. Reed," Harper continued, "when did Thomas first mention to you that he had been Ellie Mather's reading mentor?" Margaret's composure wavered momentarily. "I don't recall him specifically mentioning that." "So you were unaware that your son had regular contact with the victim prior to her death?" "Objection," Donovan interrupted. "Counsel is characterizing the relationship to prejudice the witness." "Sustained," Judge Malloy ruled. From her seat behind Harper, Baines watched Margaret carefully. The former prosecutor's right hand fidgeted with her necklace whenever Harper mentioned Ellie, a small but telling gesture of discomfort. "Mrs. Reed," Harper tried again, "would it surprise you to learn that Thomas specifically requested to mentor Ellie's reading group?" My son has always been dedicated to community service, Margaret replied, avoiding the question's substance. He volunteered with many children. As the cross-examination continued, Baines noticed how Margaret's answers became increasingly formal and less specific when discussing Thomas's childhood. When Harper asked about behavioral incidents during Thomas's youth, Margaret claimed no memory of any concerning patterns. Just normal boyhood high spirits, she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. After the testimony concluded, Baines watched Margaret in the courthouse restroom. Alone before the mirror, Margaret's public face crumpled briefly. She splashed water on her cheeks, unaware that Leah Jenkins, Harper's assistant, had entered a stall moments before. When Margaret left, Leah immediately found Baines. She was crying, Leah whispered. Actually crying. And she said something, I think to herself, about not again. Later that afternoon, Harper discovered school records showing that Thomas had been involved in 3 separate disciplinary incidents in elementary school, all expunged through legal intervention by his father. One involved a younger child who'd reportedly been locked in a storage closet for hours. She lied under oath, Harper told Baines, tapping the records. Margaret knew about these incidents. As a former prosecutor, she would have understood their significance. The question is why, Baines replied thoughtfully. Is she protecting her son out of maternal instinct, or something else? That night, Baines compiled a timeline of Margaret's statements, noting the inconsistencies. She remembered the flicker of doubt she'd seen cross Margaret's face during the previous hearing, the first crack in the unified Reed family front. Harper called late, his voice tight with frustration. Judge Malloy just granted the defense motion to exclude Martha Wilson's preliminary statement since she can't appear to confirm it. They're systematically dismantling our case, Baines observed. There's one thing they can't control, Harper replied. The trial date is set for 6 weeks from now, and I just learned something interesting about Thomas's current cellmate. What's that? He's being released next week, and he claims Thomas talks in his sleep. The county detention center stood apart from Millfield's quaint architecture, a utilitarian block of concrete and steel where Thomas Reed awaited trial. Despite his family's influence, bail had been denied, a rare victory for the prosecution. Jason Mercer occupied the cell adjacent to Thomas's. At 34, with weathered features and tattoos marking his forearms, Jason was finishing a 6-month sentence for check fraud, a far cry from the violent offenders usually housed in this section. This placement was no accident. The prosecution had arranged it hoping Thomas might let something slip. Baines and Harper met Jason in an interview room painted institutional beige, its fluorescent lights humming overhead. I wasn't looking to get involved, Jason began, his fingers drumming nervously on the metal table. But some things you can't unhear, you know. According to Jason, Thomas was the model inmate during waking hours, polite to guards, reading legal texts, writing letters. But at night, something changed. 3 nights ago, around 2 a.m., he started mumbling in his sleep, Jason explained. At first, it was just noise. Then I heard him say, clear as day, she shouldn't have told about our secret. Jason leaned forward, lowering his voice. I didn't think much of it until the next morning when I saw his case on the news. Then the night after that, he said, something else, something like, no one believes little girls anyway. Did anyone else hear this? Harper asked. Jason shook his head. Just me. The guard does rounds every hour, but he doesn't stop to listen. Why come forward? Baines questioned, studying his face for deception. You're being released next week. You could walk away from all this. Jason's eyes dropped to the table. I've got a niece Ellie's age. If something happened to her. He didn't finish the sentence. After confirming Jason would testify, Baines pursued a new lead. She contacted Ellie's elementary school teacher, Ms. Patterson, who had been reluctant to speak previously, fearing community backlash. Ellie did mention something concerning, about a week before she disappeared, Ms. Patterson admitted in her empty classroom. She said her big friend from reading made her uncomfortable sometimes. Did she explain why? Baines asked gently. She said he told her secrets and that if she ever told anyone something bad would happen. Ms. Patterson's voice caught. I asked her who this friend was, but she just clammed up. I planned to follow up, but then tears filled her eyes. You couldn't have known? Baines assured her. This new information electrified the case, connecting Thomas's sleep-talking to Ellie's cryptic warning. But the defense team moved swiftly to discredit Jason Mercer, highlighting his criminal record and suggesting he fabricated the story for potential benefits. A convicted fraudster suddenly remembers convenient sleep-talking? Donovan argued to reporters outside the courthouse. This desperation shows how weak the prosecution's case truly is. Meanwhile, Margaret Reed made her weekly visit to the detention center. Through the visitor's glass, she maintained her supportive demeanor. But Baines, who had arranged to be present, noticed how Margaret's expression changed when Thomas mentioned Jason. He's nothing, Thomas said dismissively. A career criminal trying to reduce his sentence. Is there any truth to what he's saying? Margaret asked, her voice barely audible on the security recording. Thomas's smile remained fixed, but his eyes hardened. Mother, you know me better than that. Something in his tone made Margaret flinch almost imperceptibly. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it. A subtle threat underlying the reassurance. Later, evening, as Margaret left the detention center, she sat in her car for nearly 20 minutes before starting the engine. Through the security camera, Baines watched her press her forehead against the steering wheel, her shoulders shaking in what appeared to be silent sobs. She knows something, Baines told Harper over the phone. Something she's afraid to admit, even to herself. We need more, Harper replied. The judge will throw out Jason's testimony without corroboration. We need hard evidence linking Thomas directly to Ellie. I think it's time we look deeper into Thomas's past, Baines said. If he did this once. You think there are others? People like Thomas don't start with murder. There's always a pattern, a progression. We just need to find it. What neither of them realized was that the pattern existed not just in Thomas's past, but in the Reed family history, buried in sealed records that had been carefully hidden for years. 3 weeks before the trial, Sarah Baines arrived at her temporary office to find a plain manila envelope on her desk. No postmark, no return address, just her name written in block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with a case number and 4 words: Juvenile Records, Access Code, Prometheus. Baines stared at the paper, pulse quickening. Juvenile records were sealed by law, virtually inaccessible without court orders that the Reed family's influence had consistently blocked. Someone was taking an enormous risk. Anonymous tip? Harper asked when she called him. Delivered directly to my desk, which means someone inside the department, Baines replied. I need to check this immediately. The county records archive occupied the courthouse basement, a labyrinth of filing cabinets and shelves illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights. The elderly clerk, Mr. Simmons, squinted at Baines's badge. Juvenile records require special clearance, detective. Administrative error in the system, Baines explained, showing him the case number and access code. Judge Malloy authorized temporary access to verify correct filing. The clerk hesitated, then nodded. System's been glitchy since the upgrade, follow me. He led her to a separate room secured by a keypad lock, entered the code, and left her alone with rows of confidential files. Baines quickly located the number from her note, a case dating back 15 years, when Thomas Reed was just 9 years old. The file contained multiple incident reports, each more disturbing than the last. At age 7, Thomas had trapped a neighbor's cat in a tool shed for 3 days. At 8, he was implicated when a kindergartner was locked in a school bathroom overnight. At 9 came the most serious incident. A young girl pushed from a playground structure, resulting in a broken arm. The victim claimed Thomas had threatened her previously for telling his secrets. Each report ended the same way. Case resolved through mediation. Record sealed. By judicial order. Each order signed by judges with known connections to Richard Reed. As Baines photographed the documents with her phone, a smaller folder caught her eye. A psychological evaluation ordered after the playground incident. The therapist's conclusion was chilling. Subject displays concerning lack of empathy, manipulative tendencies, and advanced ability to present socially acceptable behaviors to authority figures while engaging in predatory behavior toward vulnerable peers. The recommendation had been clear: intensive therapeutic intervention required, but a handwritten note indicated the family had discontinued treatment after 3 sessions, claiming to seek alternative approaches. Baines's hands trembled slightly as she returned the files to their places. The pattern was undeniable: escalating behavior, consistent targeting of those weaker than himself, and a family system that enabled and concealed rather than addressed the growing darkness. Outside the courthouse, Baines called Harper. "We need to meet." Not at the office. An hour later, in a coffee shop 2 towns over, Baines shared her discoveries. Harper's expression grew increasingly grim as he scrolled through the photos. "This is exactly what we needed," he said. "A clear pattern of behavior covered up by the family. But we can't use it," Baines reminded him. "These records were accessed improperly. Any evidence derived from them would be thrown out." "We can't present it in court," Harper corrected, "but we can use it to guide our investigation. Now we know what to look for and where to look." That afternoon, Baines arranged a meeting with Margaret Reed under the pretense of clarifying her previous statement. She chose a public park bench, away from potential listening devices or interruptions. Margaret arrived precisely on time, composed as always, though the shadows under her eyes suggested sleepless nights. "Mrs. Reed," Baines began gently, "I'd like to talk about the playground incident when Thomas was 9 years old." Margaret's reaction was unmistakable, pure shock followed by a flash of something deeper: recognition, fear. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I think you do," Baines continued. "I think you've known for a very long time that Thomas is capable of hurting others. I think you've been protecting him, hoping he would change." Margaret stood abruptly. "This meeting is over." "He won't stop," Baines said quietly. "He never has. The only difference now is that Ellie Mathers can't be silenced with threats or family influence. She's beyond his reach, but her truth isn't." Margaret walked away without another word, but Baines noticed how her shoulders hunched slightly, as if bearing an invisible weight. For the first time, she wondered if Margaret Reed wasn't just protecting her son, but imprisoning herself. That night, security cameras captured Margaret entering her home office at 2:17 a.m., removing a key from behind a family portrait and unlocking a drawer in her desk. What she found inside would change everything. The trial of Thomas Reed began on a crisp autumn morning, exactly 3 months after Ellie Mathers disappeared. The courthouse steps teemed with media, protesters and curious onlookers as Thomas arrived with his parents, his expression appropriately solemn for the cameras. Inside courtroom 1, Thomas moved with the confidence of someone who knew the legal system intimately. Between sessions, security cameras captured moments that never made the news. Thomas coaching his own attorney on cross-examination techniques, predicting prosecution strategies with unsettling accuracy, manipulating even those tasked with defending him. "Try this approach with the teacher," Thomas whispered to Donovan during a recess, sliding a note across the table. "She's emotional about children, use that." Donovan glanced at the detailed psychological assessment Thomas had written and nodded appreciatively. "You'd make a hell of a defense attorney yourself." Thomas smiled. "That's the plan. After this unfortunate episode is behind me." Sarah Baines watched these interactions from across the courtroom, recognizing the pattern she'd seen throughout the investigation. Thomas wasn't just defending himself, he was orchestrating the entire process, staying one step ahead at every turn. In the gallery, Margaret sat rigidly beside Richard, her expression increasingly strained as the trial progressed. During breaks, she avoided her husband's attempts at reassurance, her eyes often drifting to the empty chairs where the Mathers family sat, their grief a palpable force in the courtroom. The prosecution presented their evidence methodically. The timeline. Discrepancies the pin found at the scene, Thomas's denied connection to Ellie, and Jason Mercer's testimony about Thomas's sleep-talking. Each piece alone seemed circumstantial, but together they formed a damning pattern. The defense countered by attacking the evidence chain of custody, suggesting police incompetence, and highlighting Thomas's exemplary character. Character witnesses, Teachers, professors, community leaders testified to his intelligence, generosity, and leadership. It simply isn't in his nature, insisted his undergraduate advisor. Thomas Reed is incapable of violence. Meanwhile, in the Reed family home, Margaret spent late nights searching through old family albums, finding disturbing patterns she'd previously ignored. Thomas's cold eyes in photographs with smaller children, the unexplained absences of former friends, the carefully cultivated image that had blinded her to the truth hiding in plain sight. One night, Richard discovered her reviewing these materials. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Looking for the truth," Margaret replied softly. "Something I should have done years ago." Richard's face hardened. "The truth is, our son is being persecuted by small-minded people jealous of his potential. Our job is to protect him." "Is that what we've been doing all these years?" Margaret asked. "Protecting him or enabling him?" Richard left without answering, but Margaret continued her solitary investigation, piecing together a disturbing reality she had spent decades denying. As the trial entered its second week, Thomas remained outwardly unfazed, his confident demeanor never slipping in public. But in private moments, caught only on courthouse security footage, his mask occasionally fell, revealing glimpses of the calculated manipulator beneath the polished surface. "I've been studying juries my whole life," he told Donovan after a particularly challenging day of testimony. "Trust me, they want to believe in me. People always do." What Thomas didn't realize was that one person had finally stopped believing, the one who had believed in him longest of all. After 3 grueling weeks of testimony, closing arguments concluded on a Friday afternoon. Judge Malloy's instructions to the jury were meticulous, his weathered face betraying no hint of his personal opinions on the case that had consumed his courtroom. "You must consider only the evidence presented," he reminded them. "Not media reports, not public opinion, not personal feelings about the accused or the victim. Just the facts as established through testimony and physical evidence." The jury, 7 women and 5 men from across the county, filed out to begin their deliberations. The courthouse fell into an uneasy quiet as Millfield held its collective breath. In the deliberation room, initial opinions were sharply divided. Some jurors pointed to the circumstantial nature of the evidence, while others emphasized the pattern of behavior and inconsistencies in Thomas's story. The forewoman, a retired school principal, insisted they review every piece of evidence methodically before voting. Outside, reporters camped on the courthouse steps, delivering hourly updates that contained no actual news. "The jury continues deliberations," they repeated, filling airtime with speculation and interviews with legal experts. Sarah Baines spent these tense days reviewing her case notes, searching for anything she might have missed. Harper divided his time between his office and the courthouse, prepared to respond to any jury questions. At the Reed home, down the side, atmosphere had turned glacial. Richard and Margaret occupied the same spaces without speaking, the weight of unspoken accusations filling the rooms. Each night, Richard worked late in his study, making phone calls he didn't explain. Margaret watched him with growing certainty that her husband had known their son's true nature for years. On the 3rd evening of deliberations, their silent standoff finally broke. "What did you find in your desk that night?" Richard asked suddenly over dinner. "The security system logged you in the office at 2 a.m. Margaret set down her fork deliberately. "Thomas's old journals, the ones you told me you'd destroyed when we moved." Richard's expression tightened. "Those were the ramblings of an imaginative teenager. Nothing more." "They were confessions," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Details of things he did, things we covered up, things we excused as boyish mischief, things that led directly to where we are now." "You've always been too soft with him," Richard snapped. "He needed protection, not coddling." Protection from what? Consequences? Responsibility? The very things we were supposed to teach him? In the stillness that followed, Margaret finally asked the question that had haunted her for weeks. "Did you know about Ellie before it happened?" Richard didn't answer, but his silence told her everything. The next morning, the jury sent word they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly, tension hanging in the air like an electrical charge. Thomas took his seat beside Donovan, immaculately dressed and composed as ever. Margaret entered alone, taking a seat in the second row rather than beside Richard in the first, a small but noticeable break in the united front they had presented throughout the trial. As they waited for the judge, Thomas turned briefly toward his mother. Their eyes met, and for the first time in her life, Margaret didn't see her son in those eyes. She saw a stranger, calculating, cold, assessing her usefulness to him, and in that moment, something inside. Margaret Reed finally broke free. In the matter of State versus Thomas Reed, on the count of first-degree murder, we find the defendant not guilty. The words fell into the courtroom like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock, relief, outrage, and vindication. The Mathers family clutched each other, the mother's silent scream more devastating than any sound. Harper's shoulders slumped in defeat, while Baines's face remained impassive, only her whitened knuckles revealing her emotions. Thomas maintained his composure as the verdict was read, his expression one of appropriate relief rather than triumph. But as Judge Malloy formally dismissed the charges and the cameras turned momentarily away, something changed. For just a fraction of a second, as he glanced toward Ellie's parents, the mask slipped, revealing a smirk of such cold satisfaction that Sarah Baines felt her blood freeze. That was it. That was all I needed, she whispered to herself, finally seeing the confirmation she had sought for months. Margaret saw it too, that flash of cruel victory. So quick anyone not watching carefully would have missed it. But she had been watching, had been truly seeing her. Son for perhaps the first time, and that momentary glimpse shattered the last of her illusions. As Thomas turned to accept congratulations from his legal team, Judge Malloy prepared to formally close the proceedings. Before this court adjourns, Malloy began. Your Honor, Margaret Reed's voice cut through the courtroom noise as she rose to her feet. I need to address the court. The room fell silent. Thomas turned toward his mother, his expression flickering between confusion and the first hints of alarm. Mrs. Reed, these proceedings are concluded, Judge Malloy stated firmly. They cannot be, Margaret replied, her voice gaining strength with each word. Not when justice has been denied based on incomplete evidence. Thomas's attorney grabbed his arm, murmuring urgently, but Thomas's eyes remained fixed on his mother, a warning in his gaze that had silenced her many times before. This time, she did not look away. I have evidence that was not presented in this trial, Margaret continued. Evidence I kept hidden out of misguided maternal love. Mother, Thomas said sharply, this isn't the place. He should never have been born, Margaret interrupted, her words landing like physical blows in the stunned courtroom. Chaos erupted. Donovan demanded the court be cleared, reporters pushed forward, and Judge Malloy banged his gavel repeatedly. Through it all, Margaret stood unwavering, her eyes never leaving her son's face. Remove everyone except essential personnel, Malloy ordered the bailiffs, who began clearing the gallery. Mrs. Reed approached the bench. As the courtroom emptied, leaving only the judge, attorneys, Thomas, and key officials, Margaret Reed stepped forward. From her handbag, she withdrew a small red notebook bound with a rubber band. This belongs to my son, she said, placing it on the bench. It contains confessions written in his own hand, not just about Ellie Mathers, but about others before her. Thomas lunged forward, only to be restrained by bailiffs. She's lying, he shouted, his cultivated composure completely shattered. That's not mine, but Margaret continued calmly. There are details in here only the killer could know. Details about Ellie's last moments that were never made public. Judge Malloy, visibly shaken, called an immediate recess and ordered the notebook secured as potential evidence. As Thomas was led away, his face contorted with rage, he looked nothing like the charming, collected young man who had sat before the court for weeks. Margaret remained standing alone at the center of the nearly empty courtroom, carrying both the weight of her actions and, for the first time in years, the lightness of truth. Outside, as news of the dramatic development spread, Baines found herself standing beside Margaret Reed in a quiet hallway. Why now? Baines asked softly. Why not before the verdict? Margaret's eyes were clear despite her evident exhaustion. Because I needed to be certain, not just of what he did, but of who he is. She looked toward the door where Thomas had been taken. I had to see him win, to see his real face in victory. And then I knew I could never let that face smile again. The red notebook changed everything. Its contents, meticulously documented thoughts, plans, and reflections dating back to Thomas's teenage years, provided the foundation for a new case against him. I kept this as a mother, Margaret explained to the hastily reconvened court, but I now present it as a citizen. The notebook revealed a young man who viewed manipulation as an art form, who documented his power over others with clinical detachment. Most disturbingly, it contained entries about Ellie Mathers that only someone present during her final moments could have known. The song she had been humming, the exact placement of her backpack straps, words she had spoken that had never been disclosed. Publicly, District Attorney Harper moved immediately for a mistrial based on newly discovered evidence. Judge Malloy, after reviewing the notebook's contents and hearing arguments from both sides, granted the motion and ordered Thomas held without bail pending a new trial. Richard Reed, stunned by his wife's actions, attempted to intervene legally, arguing attorney-client privilege and marital confidentiality. His efforts failed spectacularly when it became clear he had concealed evidence in previous incidents involving Thomas. The pattern was always there, Baines told reporters gathered outside the courthouse. We just couldn't access the history that would have made it clear. Inside the prosecutor's office, Margaret Reed provided a new statement, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. I've suspected for weeks, she admitted, when Detective Baines confronted me about Thomas's juvenile records. Something broke loose inside me. Memories I'd pushed down, explanations I'd accepted that never quite made sense. She described finding Thomas's journals while searching her home office, hidden in a locked drawer where Richard had assured her they'd been destroyed years. Earlier, there was an entry about Ellie, Margaret continued, her composure finally cracking. He wrote that she recognized him from the reading program and trusted him enough to follow him into the woods. He described her confusion when he... She couldn't continue. Baines placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. You're doing the right thing now, she said quietly. Too late, Margaret whispered. Much too late for Ellie. As investigators re-examined evidence with the notebook's new context, they uncovered connections to another unsolved case, the disappearance of a 12-year-old boy during Thomas's freshman year of college. The boy's body had never been found, but Thomas's notebook contained references to a first successful experiment during that exact time period, with details that matched the case. Richard Reed, confronted with the mounting evidence against his son, finally broke down during questioning, revealing years of covering up Thomas's concerning behavior, paying off victims' families, using legal maneuvers to seal records, and pressuring officials to look the other way. I thought I was protecting my family's legacy, he told investigators, looking suddenly old and defeated. Instead, I enabled a monster. For Sarah Baines, the case represented both professional vindication and profound sadness. The system had nearly failed, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because wealth and influence had buried it so effectively. This isn't just about Thomas Reed, she noted in her final case report. It's about a family system, a community, and a legal structure that allowed warning signs to be dismissed for years. Thomas, now held in isolation for his protection, maintained his innocence publicly, while his private behavior told a different story. Guards reported cold rage, calculated manipulation attempts, and occasional statements that revealed his true nature. He asked me once if I knew what it felt like to have complete control over another person, one guard reported. He said it was the only time he ever felt truly alive. As preparations for a new trial began, with charges now expanded to include the cold case, Margaret Reed faced her own painful journey. Ostracized by former friends, divorced from Richard, she lived alone with the consequences of decades of willful blindness. But she also carried something else, the knowledge that she had finally chosen truth over comfort, justice over family loyalty. It was a brutal kind of redemption, but redemption nonetheless. 1 year after Ellie Mathers disappeared, Thomas Reed stood trial again. This time, the outcome was never in doubt. The second courtroom was as packed as the first had been, but the atmosphere was entirely different. No one questioned the evidence now, not with the red notebook, Richard Reed's confession of long-term cover-ups, and forensic evidence that had been re-examined with new context. Thomas appeared changed as well. Without his mother's support or his father's influence, his carefully crafted persona had crumbled. The charming, articulate law student was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating defendant who often seemed bored by the proceedings, except when evidence from his own writings was presented. Then a disturbing light would enter his eyes as though he enjoyed hearing his own thoughts read aloud. "He's showing us who he really is now," Baines remarked to Harper during a recess. "He doesn't need the mask anymore." The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts, not only for Ellie's murder but also for the previously unsolved case from his college years. As the verdict was read, Thomas remained eerily calm, his eyes scanning the courtroom as if memorizing faces. Only when his gaze met his mother's did his composure falter slightly, not with remorse, but with a flicker of the rage he could no longer conceal behind charm and careful manipulation. Judge Malloy's sentence was unequivocal: life imprisonment without possibility of parole. "The court has rarely seen such calculated cruelty," Malloy stated, "nor such a profound betrayal of the trust placed in you by your community, your family, and especially by the children who looked to you as a mentor and role model." As Thomas was led away, the true impact of his crimes remained etched on the faces of those he'd left behind, the Mathers family, holding each other through tears of bitter vindication. Richard Reed, a broken man who would soon face his own legal consequences. Sarah Baines, already wondering about other cold cases that might bear his signature. And Margaret Reed, who sat alone in the gallery, carrying both the heaviest burden and the clearest conscience in the room. The following morning, Margaret visited Ellie's memorial in the small park near the elementary school. Early autumn light filtered through the trees as she placed a bouquet of daisies, Ellie's favorite, according to her teacher, beside the plaque bearing the child's name and photo. As she knelt there, one of the flowers fell from the arrangement, caught by a gentle breeze. Margaret retrieved it carefully, placing it back among the others. "You deserved more than silence," she whispered, touching the plaque gently. "Forgive me." Rising slowly, she walked away from the memorial and toward an uncertain future, one built on painful truth rather than comfortable lies. In the months and years that followed, Millfield gradually healed, though it would never be the same trusting place it once had been. Sarah Baines returned to the state capital but visited often, maintaining a quiet friendship. With Margaret that puzzled many, but made perfect sense to the two women who had ultimately chosen truth over all else. Thomas Reed's case became required study in criminology programs nationwide, not just for the crimes themselves, but for the family dynamics and social systems that had allowed them to continue unchecked for so long. And Margaret Reed, once Millfield's respected prosecutor and social leader, found purpose in speaking to parents and educators about recognizing warning signs that she herself had missed or denied. It was painful, thankless work, but necessary. "Nem sempre a justiça começa com juiz," she would tell her audiences, borrowing a phrase Sarah had once shared with her. "Às vezes, começa com alguém que para de mentir." Not all justice begins with a judge. Sometimes it begins with someone who stops lying.